So, Amel, was it your idea or my idea to do this?
Yes.
Yes. We jointly had the idea because both of us in various capacities have been thinking about the regime question in not just American politics, but in comparative politics quite extensively over the past couple of years. And I think that we had some conversation about a year ago in person over a dinner, and then we exchanged emails. But this question seemed kind of topical about a year ago and now seems absolutely existential. Comparative politics has a very rich array of conceptual architecture to describe what a regime is and how it's different than a government. And we think about the question of regime change as opposed to government turnover all the time. And then the one country that I know best is the one that's never had regime change in my lifetime for some definitions of regime change. And yet I find myself in several conversations a day where debating whether or not the upcoming election or indeed the past couple of years have been represented a qualitative change in the character of American democracy and how we should think about that and what that means for all of us. So my comments, which I'm not going to deliver right now, are going to sort of orbit around the question of like, what would it mean to bring this sort of question to bear on American politics? But we also have experts here from other regions of the world and also experts in American politics itself who can share their thoughts as well. Amel, you should add anything that would be useful.
I think I would just stress that when we came up with the proposal, it seemed really, a little bit out there at the time and has become more, I think, pressing by the day. A fact that alarms everyone on the panel, and we keep reflecting on the stunning events. And I think our goal is to really try to unpack this with whatever tools that we have. And I'm really grateful to the other panelists for taking this on because it's not a neat subject. It's not, a very well-established area. So for many of us, this is kind of an experimental effort to apply our tools and apply them judiciously so that we don't stretch the bounds of potential analogies and pull together what we think is most relevant for the current moment. So I'm grateful to everyone on the panel for taking that on and putting in the effort.
That's right. Thanks from me as well. Two final prefatory remarks. We'll hope to get as much participation for the audience as well, so we'll try to keep our comments as short as we can while still being pithy and interesting. And we also acknowledge two of our friends who couldn't be with us today. Sara Goodman has 2 children under 10 at home, so I'm sure she's busy doing all that sort of stuff as well. And TJ Pempel had an accident and is in surgery today, so he's unable to make it. But I know TJ in particular, if you guys don't know him, was so excited to be part of this. He's been thinking about this forever from the perspective of somebody who studies Japan, and so we're really sorry he can't be with us as well. Would anybody like to start? Anybody itching to go first?
I'll start.
All right, great. Didi.
Thanks. Well, thank you to Tom and Amel for organizing this panel. Like both of you, I used to think that the regime question in American politics was maybe an overly academic or maybe even hyperbolic way of thinking about our politics, but no longer the case. And I just want to say also to all of you out there, like working under incredibly difficult circumstances like Sara and like TJ, these are insane times to be working or to be absenting. And that is both a way of excusing the fact that my talk is more like a laundry list of stuff, but also just a way of saying like, I see you and we're all in this together in a very, impoverished sense. Today, I'm going to talk about 2 challenges to American democracy. One has to do with the quality of our civil service, the neutrality of democratic institutions. And second, to a question about democratic capitalism and responsiveness in an era of growing inequality. These are maybe not the most urgent questions when it comes to whether or not we are a democratic regime, i.e. we have a November election coming up that probably really gets at that question. But I think these are the types of erosions that lay the long-term groundwork for democratic backsliding or even regime change. And they've also worsened since the onset of the pandemic. Most of the trends I'm going to discuss today are post-March trends, even though they were sort of beginning long before then. So first on the question of the civil service. A neutral civil service and the impartial administration of the rule of law are some of the hallmarks, but also challenges, of consolidated democracies. We know that patronage and corruption remain rife around the world, and even in the liberal democracies, there are always questions about clientelism and politicization of institutions. We know that since March, Trump has really taken an overt turn towards politicizing the executive agencies. He has fired many inspectors general, which are the independent units within the agencies that oversee the agency's work themselves. So Steve Linick at the State Department, who is overseeing Mike Pompeo's use of funds, Glenn Fine, who oversaw coronavirus disbursement at the Pentagon, and Michael Atkinson, who blew the whistle on Trump in Ukraine, have all been sacked. More whistleblower complaints have emerged in this time. Rick Bright at HHS for not promoting hydroxychloroquine was demoted. This week, there was a new whistleblower complaint by Brian Murphy at DHS, where Acting Secretary Chad Wolf asked him to withhold reporting on Russian election threats. This also, the Chad Wolf is a segue to the fact that Trump has relied more on acting cabinet positions that do not require Senate approval and can be fired at his discretion, leading unsurprisingly to high levels of turnover and replacement in the cabinet at almost dizzying speeds. Also, the coronavirus pandemic response itself, instead of being managed by teams of technocrats or bureaucrats at places like, say, FEMA, was instead overseen by Mike Pence and really behind the scenes by Jared Kushner, Trump's son-in-law. We've seen overt violations of the Hatch Act implemented in the early 20th century in response to a lot of politicization of the civil service, which prohibits campaign activities by people working for the federal government. Mike Pompeo spoke at the Republican convention. Trump has been basically actively campaigning from the lawn of the Rose Garden. So in addition to all of the ways the pandemic response has been politicized, like FEMA's interdiction of supplies, the vilification of Democratic governors, sidelining CDC expertise and politicizing their recommendations, this is not just a problem of politicization or of polarization, but instead a real consolidation of executive power that tries to circumvent congressional authority and accountability. We know from Martin Schefter, Anna Jamalabous, and Barbara Geddes that protecting the state from predation is very hard. It often happens when you have high levels of political competition, and factions in both parties think it's to their long-term advantage to protect a merit-based civil service. But this is a type of state building that requires buy-in from politicians across the aisle and ongoing vigilance, since many recently elected populist leaders have slowly replaced sort of neutral civil servants with loyalists, and changed the rules so that executives, rather than legislatures, have discretion over appointments, hiring, and firing. This presents real challenges for democratic governance and accountability, and it's unclear what Trump's successors, whether they're Republican or Democratic, will do to protect the civil service. Now, on the second question of democratic capitalism, sort of the question here is what kind of democracy is really possible given the vast inequalities that not only exist, but are likely to worsen as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. The structural changes to global and domestic economies since the 1980s have produced very narrow winners and widespread losers, and mainstream parties in the liberal democracies have been slow or even unable to respond effectively. With economists now predicting a K-shaped recovery, i.e. one that is highly divergent between the wealthy and the middle and lower classes, this raises real questions of what democratic leaders can and should do. Beginning in 2017, global protests targeted failures of democracy, like rigged elections or authoritarian overreach, as well as failures of economic management and rising levels of economic inequality. So many protests have been a response to governments lifting subsidies like oil subsidies or food subsidies, or governments implementing austerity measures, pension reforms, or exposing high-level corruption scandals. The protests may be good in the long run for democracy, but they also show how powerless voters feel and have been in getting governments to respond through regular democratic channels. So the United States is already the most unequal of the OECD or advanced industrial democracies, and the recovery from 2008 has been very uneven, with the wealth gap doubling since then. Trends of this pandemic are likely to exacerbate all of this. The sectors that employ skilled or knowledge workers are more likely to allow workers to do things like work from home. Finance and tech, which are often blamed for creating inequality, have done very well. This has been a boom time for both sectors since March. Whereas retail and the service sector, some of which were already going under, like big box retail, are going to be in accelerated decline. People without college degrees, and especially people without high school degrees, are going to be much less able to do things not only like work from home, but find any kind of reliable employment whatsoever. There have been 1 million unemployment claims filed every week since March, with the exception of 1 week in August, where it was 982,000 instead. 5 times as many people have been receiving jobless benefits because of COVID than during the peak of the financial crisis and recession in 2008. we know that democracy has not provided adequate protections from precarity in an era of neoliberal or globalized, or whatever adjective you want to use, capitalism. Labor has little and declining bargaining power relative to capital, and economic mobility has declined, which will only fuel anger and distrust and provide a pretext for would-be autocrats to attack the failures of democracy and failures of leadership. So we know that United States politicians have a lot of work to do to reestablish trust, not only in their capabilities and in the parties, their ability to be responsive through policy instruments and levers, but also establish trust in the very institutions of democracy themselves. And I'll end there. I know my colleagues are going to talk about other pressing issues like race and elections, and I look forward to hearing your comments. Thanks, Tom.
That was fantastic, Didi. Thank you. And like,
Thank you.
good timing as well.
Thanks.
Anybody interested in going next? Amel, go for it.
David's moving.
David's moved closer.
Oh, David.
Am I going now? Is that what? Okay. I want to make 2 points. One is kind of a comparativist point, and one is more of an American point, not an Americanist point. But so the first point I want to mention is I was invited to one of these SSRC Anxieties of Democracy conferences a couple of years ago, and I'm going to make the same point because Americanists almost never bring this up. And I think it's interesting to have a discussion about it. And that's the role of the security forces, what comparativists call civil military relations. So I think we should first give thanks for the deep tradition of civilian control of the armed forces of the military here. You know, we're lucky the US has no presidential guard like what Putin created a couple of years ago in Russia. Tens of thousands of troops loyal to the and directly under the president's control and outside of the military's organizational structure. That doesn't exist here. But on the other hand, we've got a increasingly unaccountable secret police force, the FBI, and increasingly secret and repressive homeland security forces that through congressional action and inaction can basically act anywhere in the US, not just on the borders. And apparently a set of even less accountable and more secret federal security agencies that spy on us and collaborate with or supersede local and state police forces when national security is threatened. It's kind of interesting. Events in Portland reveal that the president can on a whim call upon thousands of troops who are not even compelled to wear name tags, much less unit insignia, when drawn into the battle space of an American city. Who knew, right? I don't know of any research on this aspect of militarization of US federal government agencies. And so that's part of it. The second aspect of this point is that we should be thankful that local and state police forces are not legally or fiscally under control of the central government. But as events in my city have shown, they're not under the control of local or state government either. So there's not much research, I think, in American politics on why it's so hard to reform police powers. Police are the most brutal of the state's coercive forces. Nothing new in that observation, right? But in the US, they're becoming more like police in other countries, allied with or even a de facto branch of the military, especially since the 90s, increasingly militarized with all the extra kit from left over from Iraq and Kuwait and all that. We just need to pay better attention to how policing has evolved, how it's emerged, how it's evolved, how it could be reformed. I'm not sure we can, but maybe we could learn something from efforts elsewhere. So that's my first point. Second point's more general, and that has to do with this question of regime contestation. And is there really regime contestation? I don't really think there is. So I'm going to just state that, be provocative and say no. So when comparativists talk about regime contestation, it's about democracy versus not democracy. That's just not what I think we're really dealing with here in the United States. Now, maybe I'm naive, but I don't think we're in a situation of polarized pluralism. That's what Sartori was talking about from the 60s, with anti-system parties on both ends of the spectrum. Now, yeah, Levitsky and Ziblatt drew attention to the guardrails of democracy, the mutual toleration, polarization, but that's not a new idea, and maybe it's a good thing that we've seen this before in American democracy. this idea was in Schumpeter 80 years ago. It was in a book Lipset wrote in 1970 about procedural extremism. Linz was writing about this 50, 60 years ago, about parties willing to undermine the norms of democracy and curtail their opponents' civil liberties. And so, what are we really living through? Linz was talking about the roots of polarization 50 years ago as lying in the deep structural strains in society, a legitimation crisis, and how this gets channeled through the parties, which all become disloyal to the democratic system itself. And I just, before COVID, I don't think we were in such a situation, and I don't think we're in one now. Yes, I think Trump and the Republicans are trying to manufacture a crisis like this. And, millions more people could drink the QAnon Kool-Aid. But I'm not so sure we're far enough along that enough people are really buying what they're selling to call this that kind of crisis. The US has been through and survived much worse. So we're not in a situation that Linz or Sartori most feared, which is that when both parties abandoned the center. I mean, this was the problem of Weimar and the great fear of the interwar era. Things fall apart, the center cannot hold and all of that. But in the US today, the center can hold because that's where most of the voters still are. And that's why Democrats still have strong incentives to stake their flag there. Despite the game of capture the flag, they're playing with, between the center and the left and the Democrats. And so the number of people on the far left in the US is just too small. Ultimately, the Democrats have far more incentives to compromise than the Republicans do. And, maybe that doesn't make you happy. That makes a lot of lefty academics unhappy that the center is the place where reforms go to die. But if there is an arc of history, and if it does bend towards justice, it's a long, slow path. And the reason it is because perpetually there's a tension between property and democracy here. And in the US, sure, many property people could care less about democracy, but many more, I think, property people, the white middle and upper middle class, like democracy. And there's no electoral market for overturning democracy or overturning property. No matter how much the surveys show that kids today love socialism, right? LOL. At best, reform is where we're headed. Slow reform, if we're lucky, if we're good. So I just want to, say, look, the first book I read in college was Schachtschneider, Semi-Sovereign People, right? And then I read Huntington's 1980 book, The Promise of Disharmony, which just elaborated Schachtschneider. It's about the gap between American ideals and the practice of American politics. And yeah, we've narrowed this gap over history. We've inched along that arc of history. But we have to remember at the founding, it wasn't a teeny crack, right? It was a chasm, most obviously for Blacks and women. And so what are we dealing with today? American democracy works still to this day the way it was designed to work. It's an anti-majoritarian system that protects the property of white men. It was designed that way to entrench inequalities and to push back against any threatened change. Yeah, the Republicans will chip away as much as they can at any gains towards political equality. Now, we're not ever going to move towards full economic inequality. My point is, the focus today is on what we call minimalist democracy in comparative politics, guaranteeing dolls political rights, participation, contestation. That's about the promise of fulfilling the promise of American democracy, making its stated principles meet its practice. We're not worried about a military coup. We're not worried about an auto golpe, but about basic civil and political rights. Now, most political scientists disdain this minimalist conception of democracy, but that's what's really being contested now. And so I'd like to be optimistic that that's what we can protect. I mean, we have to remember, like Schumpeter wrote his book as a eulogy for democracy and capitalism because of the Depression, but they both came back much stronger than ever. Now there's no left alternative to democracy or capitalism on the right. There's no fascism. All we have is kind of Orban's illiberal democracy, but I don't see us going there fully. And why? It's partly because Hungarians who don't like Orban can move to France, but I don't see 40 million Americans moving to Canada. And the idea of moving to Canada is just white privilege, right? Blacks and Latinos aren't going anywhere. They're going to be here and they're going to fight. So I'm trying to be optimistic, even though I know anytime I turn on Facebook, I want to go hide under a rock. This problem is going to be here for at least a generation, polarization, et cetera. But maybe cohort replacement is real and things will become more liberal. I don't know. I just don't see contestation ever really being about democracy versus not democracy. It's about the same thing it's always been about fulfilling those ideals, making those ideals stated match the practice of American politics. Samuel's out.
Great job, David. We're 2 for 2. Who wants to go next? Amel, are you ready?
I am ready, and my comments will kind of build on David, so maybe I'll go next. So first I want to say that I tend to agree with David that we don't have this classical form of regime contention taking place, but I do think that there is another form of regime contention that's happening. And this is a topic that I think about a lot, but when it came time to think through my comments, I struggled to find something to say that was both non-obvious and more elaborate than "wow, we're in a lot of trouble." So this was my attempt, and I decided to make my focal point a topic that I've been working on a little, the issue of mail-in ballots, and trying to puzzle through what it is we're actually fighting about when we fight about mail-in ballots. Because I think on the one hand, it's a really old debate. It's a really old struggle that's been around for a considerable amount of time between those who are advocating greater access to voting in various forms, and those who are pushing back against that, saying that greater access is likely to lead to ease of election fraud or corruption. Now, because I know my audience, I'm going to ask you to suspend disbelief on this occasion, because I know that the instances of electoral fraud are minimal and infrequent. But essentially, I think what I'm asking is that you consider that those who are making those claims are making them sincerely, and they believe them, and that gets to the heart of questions of democratic legitimacy, whether or not they should believe them. So what is it that we're fighting about? This is an old struggle. I think it's been intensified and heightened by a couple of things. Obviously, the circumstances of the pandemic that make it dangerous to vote and likely to lead to voter suppression. And in addition, what's most alarming to many is that this will surely be a messy, contested election that is likely to be decided in the courts. And we don't seem to have a playbook. And so if democracy is in agreement to play the game by a certain set of rules, then we are in a little trouble, because I think like no time in recent history, we no longer have broad agreement on those rules. So within this struggle, we are apt to see some of the contours of broader regime contention taking place within the country. But I would like to take a step back and look at different kinds of regime contention that might be taking place. Many commentators looking at this debate and against the backdrop of what the other events in the country see in it the classical form of regime contention that David mentioned, a struggle between Democrats and non-Democrats. And increasingly, we see rhetoric both in the public sphere and even in scholarly circles attempting to uncover what would be a latent authoritarianism of the right and tendencies towards authoritarianism. So seeing in these actions an actual move towards autocracy. So I think this is actually conflating two separate things. I do think that there is some level of regime contention in the classical sense taking place here, but I don't think that that's mostly or primarily what's happening here. And what I want to suggest is that what we're witnessing is a different kind of regime contention between separate forces emphasizing competing democratic values. And many of the analogies, I think, to interwar Europe are erroneous, because there is some insight to be gleaned, but a lot of, so interwar Europe is the period that I work on mostly. And that's a different political universe, one in which there are alternatives to democracy and viable alternatives to democracy. I think there's a bit of both kinds of regime contention in that period as well. But I don't think we are likely to see that form of regime contention in the United States today, essentially because democracy is hegemonic as a principle, as an ideal of governance. So any argument on the regime continuum is going to invoke the language and the principles of democracy. And I think there is a tendency, both on the left and the right, but I'll focus on the left because that's where my attention is mostly focused. But I think there's a tendency to dismiss the sincerity of the right's claim to democratic legitimacy, and to also downplay the fact that the left's own claims to democratic legitimacy are also informed by partisan preferences. The push to increase participation and access to voting is no doubt a noble one in principle, but we also know that in practice, the way this operates is that parties target very narrowly their own voters, which they can identify with ever greater precision thanks to advances in voter databases and micro-targeting efforts. So the push to increase voter participation also has partisan implications. And I think that's fine, but we need to acknowledge it and to acknowledge that there is partisanship embedded within democracy, because there's often a tendency to see partisanship as something that is in conflict with or somehow outside of democratic values. And I'll mention quickly a recent article that I thought was very interesting by Milan Svolik, talking about polarization versus democracy, and making the case that in times of heightened polarization, voters abandon democratic principles for partisan interests. I think it's a great article, and I think it's a really good way to focus on the impact of polarization in democratic politics. But I do, I would make a couple of amendments or alterations. First is that we should not take for granted that there is a single democratic politics or principle that is being forsaken for partisan interests. And the second, so there are multiple and competing democratic values at work. And the second is, I think it's a mistake to even think that the two are separable, that partisanship somehow sits outside of democracy, or that democratic principles are not always informed by self-interested calculations. Or to put it differently, I would say the choice of which democratic principle to promote is always informed by other values, material, ideological, etc. We use democracy to advance our team. And this is not said to denigrate democratic values, but to say that ideals and interests are always mutually constitutive. So I hope that what this alerts us to is the idea that regime contention is not always a struggle between Democrats and non-Democrats, democracy's defenders versus democracy's detractors, or even democracy versus partisanship. I would say that we're potentially looking at right now is democracy versus democracy. And that is a real problem in that both sides are purportedly defending democracy, but operating according to very different sets of rules and different notions of legitimacy. And I think that in the current moment in the United States, both forms of regime contention are present, but we tend to focus only on the former, on the classical form of regime contention. And I think it's tempting to see those who oppose us as opposed to democracy. It's much scarier to think that those who oppose us also claim democratic credentials and claim them convincingly to their audience. The second form of regime contention, I think, is actually much more dangerous because it speaks to a breakdown in the discursive building blocks of a democratic consensus. And so not only do we no longer agree upon the rules, we're no longer operating or speaking the same language. And so that is not a really optimistic note to land on. But I will try to say, as one last point, that I think we're also witnessing regime contention on the left, and contention and challenges to the way we define democracy and inclusion within that democracy. So there's a lot of play and flexibility in this competition over what democracy is and which democratic values will be emphasized. And that is where I look to for a more hopeful and less nihilistic version of this competition over democracy. I'll stop there.
Gosh, you guys are awesome. We're 3 for 3. Those were great. Julia, you want to go next?
Yeah, I think my comments build pretty well on this. Although I'm starting to think I really have a laundry list, and Didi's laundry list was very well organized. I'm not sure mine is. But in the interest of trying to keep myself organized, I'll start by saying that I have 3 things that I want to cover here, and I promised Tom I'd do it in 4.5 minutes. The first one is this sort of idea of flipping around our assumptions about what American democracy is and has been, how long the United States has been a democracy, and what norms and stability actually mean in the US context. The second one, I want to talk briefly about the American presidency, and then I want to end by talking about political parties, just because I wouldn't be me if I didn't. I want to start with this idea that American politics has actually perpetually been a kind of politics of regime contestation. This is similar to what Amel was just saying about this sort of competing visions of democracy. If you read about 19th century American political, contestation among different visions of the presidency, different visions of the role of the federal government, every election, a normal election, is contestation over those issues. At the same time, it's not just that there are these competing visions of democracy that are normally in contention in the electoral process, but that this is not actually a democratic situation. This is an ethnic conflict situation. This is an authoritarian state for a substantial portion of the population. So I would actually argue, first of all, that the United States wasn't a democracy until 1965, and I will die on that hill. That you can't really call a country that doesn't protect the voting rights of its citizens on the basis of their race a democracy, and a country that essentially allows for racialized violence to happen while the state, in the best case scenario, looks the other way. I think that's really linked to how we understand periods of stability and instability. And the periods of upheaval in American democracy are also the periods of moving toward democratization. This is very much linked to what is going on beneath the surface of normal politics. And here I know several people on this panel have heard me talk about this before, because I've been working on this for a couple of years now, but I'm working on a project trying to explore the linkage between the presidency, race, and kind of political upheaval and impeachment. So I essentially have this argument that presidents have played this preservationist role, preserving political compromise and stability within their own parties and in the country as a whole, around essentially racial hierarchies. You see this leading up to the Civil War. Party politics is all about keeping essentially North and South together. You see this kind of same thing in the period leading up to Jim Crow. And when presidents put the power of the presidency behind the notion that we should reverse this racial hierarchy, when presidents put that power behind challenging those compromises that preserve that hierarchy, then we see this kind of decline in legitimacy. And I think that forces us to reckon with what we're saying when we talk about stability and what we're saying when we're talking about preserving legitimacy. And that's where, and I think an interesting pattern here that I'm trying to suss out the connection with is when you see presidents do that, so Lincoln, LBJ, Obama to some extent also represents a kind of confrontation of racial neutrality, their successors get impeached, which I take as sort of a marker of the decline of legitimacy. So I think that people who study American politics ought to be very critical of our emphasis on stability and our emphasis on sort of divisiveness bad, unity good. A lot of those questions, I think, fall into this trap of being facially race neutral, but actually, working in service of preserving racist structures in American politics, or sort of tolerating those in our scholarly analysis and discourse. So that's my point about democratization. The second one is the evolution of the presidency. And this is a pretty familiar one, and we know the American presidency is quite strong, except when we're talking about the American presidency not being strong, right? Except when we're talking about the American presidency being inadequate to the task. And I think that a fulsome understanding of this is to understand how these things are both operating at the same time. The presidency is simultaneously unable in many cases to actually rise to the occasion of resolving political problems, but also very difficult to hold accountable. And that's, I think, the story of the Trump presidency is really coming out once again of this impeachment episode. You heard a lot of like kind of, my Twitter feed was full of like, we couldn't keep the republic after the Trump impeachment failed. And the reality is that Trump has revealed this. He hasn't changed this. It's very difficult to hold presidents accountable. Polarization has made that worse because it's deepened partisan loyalty. But it's never kind of not been true. It's very difficult to hold the presidency accountable for the kinds of abuse of power that executive politics opens itself up to. And finally, I think I'm at about the 4-minute mark. I want to talk about the challenge of parties as representative institutions and the role that plays in kind of thinking about the practice of American democracy. So the challenge of parties as representative institutions. We've had a lot of ink spilled about this, about the rise of populism, the weakness of parties. In the United States, this is very much linked to a debate about the development of the direct primary and the weakness of parties' capacity to control who their nominees are. But I think we also need to contextualize this and just how crucial parties have been to American democracy, how much work they're doing in the first place. So political parties created mass democracy. They've done much of the work of mobilizing voters, and they've traditionally served as the first locations for these deep political conflicts, especially about race, which I've just mentioned. And political parties have eroded as organizations. Some intellectual movements in the study of American politics have identified the role of parties as essentially outsourced to affiliated groups, so private civil society. I've been thinking a lot about this with regard to the role of the NBA. The NBA decision to suspend their season back in March signaled in a way that I'm not sure any public institution could have credibly signaled to the public about the seriousness of the COVID crisis. Here in Milwaukee, I don't know if this is happening other places, but the arena where the Bucks play is going to be a big voting location. We've also seen leadership among NBA players on the issue of some of these protests and Black Lives Matter and things like that. And so the NBA is actually playing this sort of civic role, both in their communication, but also in some very practical ways. They're a private organization. And they're also performing this civic action, I think, as a sort of subsidiary of the Democratic Party. So these things are both simultaneously not of a party, but not, to speak to what Didi was saying about civic institutions, not devoid of partisanship. So I think that's actually where, as Americanists, if we're going to think about the quality of this regime, we need to think about what institutions have actually been carrying out American democracy and take parties seriously in that role, and then think about how that's becoming privatized and outsourced, and take more, I think, of a kind of ground level look at what it means to practice democracy, as opposed to just the sort of institutional view that we've typically taken when thinking about how regimes work. Okay, I have no idea where I'm at minute-wise, but that's what I've got. Thanks.
That was great. We're 4 for 4. I have the opportunity to not make it a grand slam here. Wait, no, 5 for 5 is not a sports metaphor. I can still let you down. So I'm going to take my remaining time to speak about issues that draw in various ways on themes that we've heard before. I'm going to agree with some of you and disagree with some of you. I'm also going to channel some of what TJ was going to say about experiences that we might draw from. And I'll try to do the same thing also in 5 minutes. So I want to begin by fixing my understanding of what regime contestation means by doing a kind of grad school definition exercise and just saying what I think a regime is. So I think of a political regime, drawing on the terminology of comparative politics, as a set of authoritative institutions and procedures for allocating political authority within a country. And so, again, a set of authoritative political institutions for allocating political authority within a country. And we have one of those in the United States right now. But that definition of a political regime does not make two assumptions that we often think about at the same time. So that regime exists does not imply that it is legitimate, that those are the procedures, a certain set of procedures exists to allocate political authority is not a definitional, not definitionally equivalent with the statement that that is believed in or sort of abstractly legitimate among some or all of the citizens who are governed by that regime. And second, something that I've learned, especially from reading work from Julia over the past couple of years, those regimes, the institutions, procedures that define a political regime need not be formal. And in fact, they are almost entirely informal, right? So this is not something that one simply reads off of a constitution or by figuring out who wins elections, but also there's a whole suite of institutions that govern these procedures. So when I express my consternation with the state of American politics today, that I fear that our regime is changing. I specifically mean to say that we are discovering a new set of authoritative institutions and procedures for allocating political authority. I think that this is a weighty qualitative difference. That our regime is changing is not an endorsement of the status quo in unqualified terms. The status quo is problematic or unjust in many different ways, but I do believe that the change that we are going towards is strictly worse. It's also possible that regime change, at least conceptually, could be normatively a good thing, right? So one often hears about the Maoist or Leninist approach of accelerating the contradictions in order to find us in the situation where we have to have a total refoulement of the entire system and we recreate something new. That's in principle something that can happen, but I'm going to argue that that is not what is happening right now. The acceleration of the contradictions is not going to break in ways that generate, I think, broadly normatively good outcomes. So picking up on so that's what I think about when I talk about regimes and regime change. And I think that we are fighting right now in American politics over what is the set of authoritative institutions, procedures that will allocate political authority. The analogs to this, David is right, Amel is right, are not the classic cases of regime contestation that we've talked about in the past, in which you have two anti-system parties, one on the left, one on the right, or anti-system factions, duking it out over replacing it with something else. We are much closer to a system of regime decay as the proximate mechanism of regime change that is much more similar in my mind to the decay of the Fourth Republic into the Fifth Republic in France, or the decay of constitutional democracy in Indonesia in 1957. So there's a real late 50s vibe that I'm getting in politics around the world right now, and I think that we're seeing this right now. So we have other cases of that in modern history. They are not found in Western Europe, but they are cases in which you have non-extreme parties or non-extreme forms of political contestation that result in regime change. The classic case is, or the exemplary case here is Thailand. This is not a fight over which extremist is going to defeat the rest and replace democracy with something else. This is a fight over the center. Who is the legitimate people? Who are the ones who deserve to write the Constitution? Who are the ones whose votes should be counted? And who are the ones who are the other? Who is, when we hear the term silent majority, we are hearing an indication of the concept of a center that exists, that is the legitimate people and the others, the peripheral people, the minorities, the homosexuals, the socialists, depends on what social formation we're talking about. These are the ones pitched as the outside. So I agree that this is not a question of anti-system parties. It's a fight over the essence of who should be governed by the system. What is the system about to govern? And the problem is, as David, I think, did recognize, the system is anti-majoritarian, and yet there are larger and larger numerical majorities who do not share the interests of the minority that is being benefited from this. So what does this say going forward? I'm not optimistic. The solution, if you think about this in terms of our models of how regime change happens, or our sort of formal models of what keeps multidimensional politics in the Congress from flying out into disorganization, is we need to have consensus over the rules. And that consensus is not achieved democratically. We need something like a constituent assembly that establishes anew what the procedures are going to be to allocate political authority. This will require elites to agree that a consensus of that form is possible and on the procedures through which to hash that out. The alternatives are either the status quo, which I do not think is going to hold, or the other alternative is frankly terrifying. It's war. So you can have this consensus achieved either by elites leading it or by the rejection through force of the system that exists. A victory by Biden will no more solve this problem than will a victory by Trump. We are off the rails. We left the train, to evoke the metaphor shared to me by my former colleague, Jonathan Kirshner, the train ran off the tracks. We are no longer on the rails. The engine is going off the bridge. We don't know what's at the bottom right now, but we are not putting this back together. We are not returning to 2008 or 2004 even. This is over. President Trump is qualitatively different. He did reveal the pathologies of our presidential democracy. Julia's right. He didn't create them. He revealed them to people who did not know or who hadn't been paying attention. But he also destroyed more governing norms, more of the stabilizing governing norms than anyone else has. Now, I'm happy to argue about who started it. And I can make the argument that either it was Newt Gingrich in 1995 who told the first great lie, or perhaps it was Lyndon Johnson in 1964 with the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution who told the first great lie that undermined our support in the system. But Trump, to borrow a New Testament metaphor, he did not come to destroy, but to fulfill. Right? He represents the ultimate expression of this, and he's taken it further than anyone else had. So my outlook is the skeptical counterpart, I think, of David. I agree with most of what David said, except for the implications. I think that the battle over voting rights, mail-in ballots, whether or not we will put voting booths in places where Black people live, is essentially an argument about whether or not we are going to explicitly change what it means to select the leaders of this country. And again, that it has never been perfectly democratic is not my point. The point is that it is going to get worse without some sort of consensus in order to replace it. And I do not know where that consensus comes from at a moment like this. Thanks. So that draws us to a close of our formal comments here. How would we like to do this? Would we like to just turn it over to the audience? Or should we maybe collect responses from our panelists before doing that? Maybe just briefly, if anybody wants to jump in with a response.
You clearly need to go outside and get some sunshine or something.
It's been hard. Pandemic's been hard on all of us. Let's turn it over to our audience. Does anybody have any questions? Or it doesn't have to be a question, it can be a comment. We've got about 27 minutes or 37 minutes, so we've plenty of time.
Julia looked like she was going to say something, and I don't think she's finished her 4.5 minutes.
Really?
Like
no,
9,
I was, maybe. What, huh? I was just thinking about, I mean, as I was talking, I was sort of thinking, I don't think I think about regime the same way that comparativists do. That's like, and I come from the American political development tradition where I think actually, compared with mainstream Americanists, we do think about these questions. And like, we talk about, I mean, like state building and contestation, and we talk about regimes a little differently. kind of assuming the same constitution but with different interpretations maybe is the way that we think about it. We've been thinking about race since before it was cool, and yet I don't think I really think about this in quite the same way that the rest of you do, but I haven't really puzzled out what that means.
I'll just add, I don't have the only definition of regime out there. I'm not an authority on this one necessarily.
I think the APD scholars typically think of a regime as sort of like an order, like a set of orders, which is different from how comparativists think about it. Although I think you are adopting a lot of our, at least language and analytical frameworks in your remarks.
But it's because they don't consider non-democracy to be part of the
as an
discussion.
option. Correct. Yeah, David, that's right. I think.
Which is that's where I think we need to flip things around. We need to understand America as by default not a democracy.
Right.
Sorry, go ahead, Amel.
I was just going to stress this point that you've made a couple of times now, because I think comparativists especially benefit from it. Comparativists who had not been paying attention to the United States suddenly started paying attention in 2016, and suddenly, democracy was decaying in the United States. And I think, the alarm, it was sincere and it was probably well-intentioned, but it did end up having this conservative preservationist undertone, which is that what we're trying to keep is whatever we had before 2016, without really any recognition of the massive flaws and discriminatory, exclusionary practices that have inhabited the United States. I think, yes, you can absolutely pick 1965, but we can also offer many examples of exclusionary practices post-1965. So for APD and Americanists, I think the perspective is much more of an ebb and flow in democratic attributes that are exchanged over time. And I think I value these exchanges because on the receiving end, it's helpful to understand that, no, this was not what we should not be seeking, some kind of preservationist return to a pre-Trump status quo.
But I would also say that Americanists typically talk about problems in American democracy as there's like a sort of continuities element to a lot of that literature, like the, voter ID laws, for example. I think comparativists are more likely to see that as part and parcel of exclusion and something anti-democratic, although I see, Amel, we can debate whether or not it's truly anti-democratic or instead just a way of perhaps being partisan or whatever. But I think it's useful to use a comparative framework because Americanists often write about things by assuming that things in American politics will look a certain way. Whereas if you zoom out, you realize that that can actually be a signal of democratic decline or backsliding, or just something highly suboptimal that other democracies don't have to deal with, and we therefore shouldn't have to just accept as routine in American politics either.
I just want to be clear that I wasn't seeking this kind of relativist place where exclusion just counts as another act of partisanship.
Yeah.
And I really like Tom's framing of this being, about identity and about the definitions of citizenship and definitions of who is represented in self-governance. And I think that's another way to slice it. That's both. But we have a great question both in the chat and hands going up here. Should I read it off from Carolyn Holmes? Or Carolyn, do you want to read it off?
You can pose it yourself if you like.
Yeah.
Thank you. So I'm just wondering, getting back to some of the things that have been debated over the course of the panel, right? Obviously, from a substantively democratic point of view, I very much agree with Julia in terms of the United States becoming meaningfully democratic in 1965, or even qualified democracy after that. But isn't it still important, speaking to Amel's point, that everyone is using the language of democracy, right? George Wallace thought of himself as a Democrat. So did the people that were in charge of apartheid South Africa, right? That was part of their legitimating strategy. And so is talking about this in terms of regimes, meaning institutions, in sort of Thomas's point of view, is that appropriate? Because there is this sort of democratic consensus that underlies all of this, even if the institutions are not democratic? Does it matter that the democratic lip service is still there and is still sort of a performance, even if what we're really talking about is minority rule?
I mean, I'll enter briefly because I wrote a whole book on how when presidents talk about their election result, they usually do it when they're having legitimacy problems. So I think like just empirical, I think this is like a deeper theoretical question that I maybe am prepared to answer, but from an empirical perspective in the US, like that, the language of democracy tends to get trotted out at the most problematic times. But I know that this is true in a lot of comparative contexts, that leaders use the language of democracy as I think to use your language, the legitimating instrument. And perhaps that is significant that they're not drawing on some other kind of, divine right or some other idea, but I don't quite know how it's significant.
I'd also add that I think that there's a kind of specifying that happens when at moments of regime contestation such as this one, in which you add adjectives to your democracy label in order to justify what you really mean. So I don't think that anybody in apartheid South Africa thought they were the same thing as America in 1979. They would not, we are we are apartheid democracy. We are our democracy, the democracy that fits for us. And it's recognized to be fundamentally at variance with the practice of democracy in other places. In Indonesia, the idea was that we needed to replace the democracy that isn't working with guided democracy, which is designed to sort of stop everybody from fighting all the time and just have a strong leader who can put us on the rails. And so it's never an unqualified sense of democracy. But I do think that you're certainly right that this language universally invokes cultural arguments to justify the character of the democracy, which is either being proposed or imposed at the time at which it's happening.
But I guess it's also to the extent that invoking democracy is about just representing the people effectively. That's how basically all of the populists in Western democracies at least have spoken since 2010. So I don't know. I think that it's good that sort of unabashed autocratic rhetoric is no longer on the table. And it's good, I think, that some autocrats realize, or would-be autocrats, that they need to embrace the language of democracy. But I think it also shows how malleable and thin a lot of this language is at the end of the day. It's sort of these hollow concepts, and they become these sort of tabula rasa onto which politicians can say that they're truly representing the people, or look at all the things that aren't working right now, only I can do what the people want. It's a highly, prescribed notion of who the people are, and that's what's contested. But I think in the 21st century, you're unlikely to get leaders who are democratically elected in some way who aren't going to use that language.
Should we take another question? Jennifer?
Hi, everyone. I apologize for walking into the panel room so late. I was actually in class. So, in 2020, I can teach 2 classes and then go to an APSA panel. It's awesome. But I'm sorry I missed half the discussion. And so maybe my question or what I'm thinking about may have already been addressed to some extent. But it sort of picks up a little bit of where Carolyn just was in thinking about this relationship between institutions and regime. And particularly in the context of the United States, and thinking about, as Tom said, we're off the rails, and where do we go from here? It seems obvious to political scientists that there has to be some sort of institutional reform that happens to help get things back on the rails. But I don't, partisans don't have any incentives to have those conversations. And I don't even really hear that many political scientists having those conversations yet. So I'm interested to hear your thoughts about where you think the United States is, both on this question of which conversations should we be prioritizing about institutions that could get us back on the rails and create more democracy for more people in the United States. Where do we even start that?
I will start. Thank you for that question, Jennifer. And it's nice to meet you. I don't know if we've ever met in person, but I'm a big fan. Anyway, so I think the language of pacted transitions, or like some of the concepts from that, might help. It's sort of like what Tom was saying about needing to establish some impartial, or maybe everybody is highly partial, but they need to get together and sort of go back to the drawing board on what the rules of the game are. In a democratic transition, with a pacted transition, you need agreement among different types of elites who have very different material or ideological interests to at least agree on what the rules of fair play are. I don't really know what that looks like in the United States. You're right. There's an active political reform community that talks about things like voting rights or changing the electoral system, or ways to make the institutions maybe slightly more responsive to what voters want, which we know that in a first past the post plurality system you don't really get. But beyond that, I think that the first step is, if there's a post-Trump Biden administration, for example, high-level commissions to investigate things like the Russian interference and the impeachment, as well as the coronavirus pandemic, might reveal what kinds of failures existed or what kind of opportunities were presented by these crises that were then used or sort of abused, I suppose, at the highest levels. And then that might incentivize some kind of political faction to emerge across both parties to say, like, let's not do that again. I am doubtful that we can do something a little bit more popular. By that I mean involving people, whether it's a Truth and Reconciliation Commission or a Constituent Assembly. We don't have much of a history of that in the US. I know that other countries that did it didn't necessarily have a history of it either, but I think that that would be a really big ask. I am more optimistic that the elites get together, as they are wont to do in other democratic transitions, and hammer out a new sort of era of our politics.
I want to say something in response to that. Is I think Tom's. I mean, I appreciate the pessimism but the idea of some kind of national convention or whatever, I think is just far-fetched. It's kind of no way, no how. I mean, it's like nobody's interest to get rid of the electoral college and on the Republican side, just to start there. The reforms that are going to make most difference to people are the reforms that movements like BLM are advocating, and these are going to be local level and state level reforms. These are going to be things like, how do we separate like in Minneapolis, you can't control the police. The city cannot control the police because labor relations are a state level issue. And so you have to go through the state legislature. It doesn't matter what the Charter Commission, the Constitution of Minneapolis says, because the freaking county controls the appointment of the Charter Commission. I had to look this stuff up. And it really makes you realize, like, you really want to make a difference in people's lives. You got to start local. You got to start small. And that's where there are possibilities. I don't know how much possibility. I mean, we've got divided government here, but it's just by like 4 seats in one chamber of legislature. And if that could flip, and the census comes in and they reconfigure some of the seats at the local level in the state house, you could dissociate. I'm just taking one example, which is policing, which is obviously a big problem here and in a lot of other places. I just don't think it's going to be a national level conversation where you're going to see any kind of real progress.
I just want to follow up with you on that, Dave. It's an encouraging perspective, but it's decidedly policy focused. And I guess my question is, my sense is that these like regime style democracy questions that we're focused on here are sort of monumental, fundamental, like institution level kind of stuff. Do you think we can make improvements that get to that level of outcome if we focus on local level policy stuff? And the answer there might be yes, but I'm interested to hear what you think the trade-offs are.
In my lifetime, or maybe at least my professional lifetime, and yours, no, because I do think this is a long-term process, and maybe that's just enough pessimism to make Pepinsky happy, but it's still optimistic. And that, I mean, I really do see. I mean, the 18-year-olds, we all know this, like they have different political attitudes. It's not just because more liberal people are going to college than 50 years ago. Kids today are more liberal than our parents' generation were, but it may take 50 years then for that to get put into policy. And even then, I think there's the question of when a 20-year-old becomes 40 and has kids and a mortgage. It's like, okay, how much reconciliation are you going to get there with kind of bourgeois values and being reluctant? You know, like my neighborhood, it's a nice neighborhood, and there was a rioting 2 blocks away, and so we all of a sudden got all next door on everything. You know, like looking for any car that had, you know, no license plates and everything, and deflating their tires. And I'm like, man, I didn't sign up for that. You know, but you know, that's how people are. So I really think it's an open question.
I want to actually jump in on, I think, what's sort of similar to what David is saying, which is to really think about the crisis of democracy, not in terms of like, what's the latest thing Trump said, but what kind of level of control do people feel like they have over their own lives? And that's kind of where, like, I think if I were writing a dissertation right now, I would be looking at workplace democracy. And I would be looking at how democracy plays out in sort of privatized spaces, which is where people live most of their lives. I think Amel wants to speak, so I'm going to shut up now, but I just wanted to point that.
I just wanted to take a stab at the institutions question from a different perspective, because I feel like I kind of led us down this rabbit hole of partisanship and democracy. And if anything is democracy, then nothing is democracy. And this is a rabbit hole that I go down on a near daily basis. And it can bring you to this kind of nihilist place. And the way I try to bring it back is, I do think there are institutional reforms that matter. I think from my perspective, combating voter suppression is the #1 priority within the United States right now. But I see that as a partisan perspective also, and I fully embrace that. I don't think we can get out of the partisanship versus democracy. And I am willing to fight for a vision of democracy that is more inclusive, that is more encompassing, and that includes fighting parties for their practices that themselves are internally exclusionary. So what I wanted to say is that, you know, I think we can fight for these institutional reforms and still understand the malleability of democratic values. What I think is essential is that we not create cartoon versions of our opponents as autocrats, because we totally miss the appeal of their own democratic values. And I think we really miss the mark of what we are trying to achieve institutionally, ideologically, whatever. So hopefully that brings us back a little from the rabbit hole, but I don't know. And I think we have other questions.
Let me just,
sorry, Tom.
I'll just tie a bow on it, I suppose, by, you know, I'm not the world's most optimistic person today, but in general, I do share some optimism. I don't think that a constituent assembly is going to happen in American politics in my lifetime, but that's what I actually do think it would take to cease this level of contestation that we have over the terms of how we choose our leaders in the United States today. I think that you can, and I encourage local experimentation to solve, you know, the chronic problem of policing. But my great uncle wrote a dissertation on the Minneapolis police force in 1976, and the same things that we were talking about then, and 3 waves of policing reform since then, and we're no closer today than we were in 1976 to solutions to these problems. So I actually think that while we might not have a constituent assembly, we can think of a version of a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, a process of lustration that involves public hearings with the cooperation of those in the GOP who are willing to participate, and probably the exclusion of those in the Democratic Party who won't. You know, what is an acceptable norm that we can have about empowering our citizens to vote? What do we need to know about the direct influence of foreign powers in undermining our democracy? And that cannot be done at the local level. That is the root of this cause is the system that people are contesting. And so I think it's easier to say, let's go down to the local level because it seems like a more manageable problem. But I worry that it's not going to have the systemic effects that we need it to have. And with that, we should let Marianne jump in.
So I'm just kind of, maybe this shifts the panel too much, but I'm curious about where does this leave us pedagogically? Like when we address questions of regime change or democracy, do we do like a temporal comparison of the US of like, here's how 2016 is the defining point, or 1965? Do we do a geographic comparison of here's how Truth Reconciliation Committees make a difference or don't? Or are we just doing our students a bigger disservice when we push the American exceptionalism thread into this very negative kind of space? Like, how do we approach that question for our students if we're expecting that thing to happen after a couple generations too?
But one of the problems we have is that no comparativist will say that most comparativists will actually say, look, historically, we're just going to have to take Bosch's or Jaworski's, actually more Bosch's definition of democracy, that half of the men voting is good enough, as a starting point to start looking at why countries become and keep democracies. Okay, that's a really small proportion of the population. But if you go Julia's way and you say it's got to be everybody or it's nothing, that's a bad path for teaching about democratization, I think.
I think it's also useful maybe to just provide some historical and analytical concepts and then let them suss it out pedagogically. Like I think you're right, it's so hard to know what the right way is to frame our current political moment. But if there are some examples from history and some of the sort of long run structural problems in American politics versus the immediate short-term ones that have been, say, 2016 related, it's actually probably interesting to see what the students come up with. They've been living also, like these younger generations, in such a different time than we were all, well, there's probably wide age differences, but then most of us were raised in a time of sort of peace and prosperity and the end of the Cold War and blah, blah, blah. And like, these are, post 2008 sort of politically socialized students who have seen American democracy fail in a lot bigger ways than I think most of us did when we were young. So, I don't know.
Yeah. I mean, so I teach American politics, and if asked, I guess I would defend exceptionalism as an empirical fact in the sense that the American case has an incredibly large population compared to the other countries we'd probably put in that sort of OECD framework, Western, democracy framework, federal, sort of highly decentralized. Our race history, which I will die on this hill, David, about that you can't really call a country a democracy if some of its citizens are enslaved or systematically disenfranchised, violently disenfranchised, and the presidency role. So that makes it, I think, really distinct among other sort of potentially comparable democracies. And I just sort of explain that as an empirical fact. But I find, as Didi said, my students have a very strong feeling about whether they live in a democracy or not. And so my purpose is really to like talk them down analytically from whatever that commitment is, and get them to like ask better questions. And really by the end of the semester, that's all I ask of myself. So if someone in the audience needs permission to take that tack, I grant it.
So I don't teach American politics, but I do teach comparativists about American politics. And I take a very related approach to Julia, but I start the other way. Instead of thinking like, what makes American democracy exceptional? I say, what makes America exceptional? And then how does its democracy reflect that? And the closest I can come to is, what other country aside from Brazil combines plantation slavery and settler colonialism? So like chattel slavery, a plantation economy, and the destruction of the indigenous people through settler
and presidentialism and federalism.
But those are consequences. The structure is, this is what made America America. And then what sort of thing would emerge to safeguard the system, the social formation that requires? But like, that's unsatisfying because it doesn't tell us about now. It just tells us like, why should we have been probably more upset with the conditions of American politics for a longer time than we are, than half of us started being in 2016.
I'll just say a couple of words here because I kind of have a foot in the APD world. So even for my comparative courses, there's a lot of focus on the US. And I recall at one point presenting the different definitions of democracy and the democracy indices. And you've got the Boyce Index, which has democracy, US as a democracy from 1800. And this was kind of early on teaching this class, and I had a student just stop me and say, how is that possible? And it was a stunning statement, and I don't know why it had such a significant impact. Well, I do know why, because it's not possible. And I will probably die on that hill with Julia as well. And my answer now and my approach now has been really to disaggregate from these regime types and to question the ascendance of regime as a category, which a little poking around in the history of the American Academy tells us that talk of regimes is in fact quite recent. So my approach has been to really disaggregate democracy, to focus on practices, and to focus on opportunities for contestation as being the ability of individuals to contest their status and to contest their inclusion in the American polity. Still, it's not super well worked out, and for those who really want regime classifications, that's not going to be satisfactory. But especially for pedagogical purposes, standing in front of that classroom, I got tired of presenting these definitions and then having to walk them all back and explain them away and say, well, you know, for our analytical purposes, we call the US a democracy, even though everyone knows it was not actually a democracy by any measure, because you cannot call it that while a significant portion of the population live unfree. So I'm open to suggestions.
I always start with Dahl. And you know, when you start with Dahl and he says, look, people, there's no such thing as polyarchy. There's no such thing as democracy. We'll call it polyarchy instead. And democracy is a utopian ideal. And, you know, in a way, maybe so is communism and all the others. But that allows you to say the Churchillian approach, at least, and defend democracy too, which is like, you know, all these other forms of government are terrible, but democracy is the least terrible, right? And that's an easy way to get through that discussion. And of course, you can go deeper into the discussion and all the different ways in which the US isn't a democracy. But at least and this is why I think VDEM has made a contribution here, and why we're going to keep debating whether democracy is a dichotomy but VDEM does allow you to get at these more finer grained elements. It's like, okay, the US was democratic in some ways and really flawed and deeply in other ways at the same time historically, and moved on some of these indicators and not on others because it didn't need to. And other countries didn't. You know, I mean, I think that is the story of American democracy is well, then we debate why the suffrage expanded, and it's still imperfect, but is much further along than it was 100 years ago and 150 years ago or 175 years ago. Anyway, I always start with Dahl in my comparative, both undergrad and grad teaching. Just the first 15 pages of polyarchy. I don't read the rest of the book. It's not very helpful. But it allows you to kind of base the discussion normatively as well as conceptually, because you don't want to, I don't want to just say, look, here's democracy, let's move forward. No, it's like you have to take a stand about what it is people fighting for, as well as what the problems that raises for us in terms of defining what we're studying.
Are there other questions from the audience? Critical reflections? I feel like I'm teaching a grad seminar.
On Zoom also, it's like,
yeah. I just want to say thank you to our panel organizers, and I think this is such a bizarre way to do APSA. I mean, it's better than nothing, but yeah, I still remember the New Orleans year when everything was canceled, and anyway, so these are crazy times, but it was really nice to chat with all of you, and we had really wonderful questions, and unfortunately, these topics are likely not to go away, even if things change in November. So I look forward to sort of an ongoing research agenda and set of discussions in the future when we can all be together.
I mean, I have a question, like, eventually we're gonna not have to do things in my daughter's bedroom anymore, right? So we're gonna be able to go out and do conferences together. Like, I would love to engage with Julia and the rest of you specifically on what the word regime means to you in your community. Like, I may have a very overdeveloped understanding of what a regime is from a comparativist perspective, but it comes from the like what is regime change? Regime change, what's the regime that we're talking about? It's democracy, but what's democracy in the abstract? Well, it's a procedure for choosing executives. Okay, so that's what we're doing here. I would love to engage on that in some other way. I feel like we could do this in New Orleans near Mardi Gras or something like that. Once.
I mean,
like,
the nice thing about Zoom is you could, for relatively low cost, I mean, the cost being people's time, we could have mini conferences, you know, sort of 3 or 4 hour things if they're not too onerous, to have big discussions instead of flying like 30 or 40 people to one location for a day and a half. I don't know. And if they're advertised, you what?
I'm sorry, I was making a joke. We could have the sequel after November, regime question after the fall.
That's not a joke. You're right. We should do that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Cornell are going to do that actually in the November or December 4th. It's going to be like the great purging of all of our fears and worries, and we'll see which way that goes. But like this question of what a regime is, I feel like that could be the source of a really provocative set of essays.
I do think that this whole time like upends a lot of the conventional wisdoms that we had. I'm thinking of my field seminars in grad school. Like, they weren't that long ago, but they're all basically totally wrong. But I mean, Dahl continues to be really important, but you're right. We have these really old concepts and they just don't really match up to reality sometimes. I think it would be helpful to talk about regimes, for example, and how we define them. Sorry, Amel.
Sorry, I was going to pick a fight with David earlier about the Dahl point, but I'll save that for the sequel.
The thing I really want to write is a critique of the sort of democracy discourse cottage industry that's sprung up after Trump was elected. But the reality up until 6 months ago is that I really liked being flown to those conferences and drinking those people's wine. So I have been hesitant to write a scathing critique, but I think that this sort of democracy industry misses a lot of key points about American politics. So I guess my point is, Tom, I can always be goaded into writing a provocative essay, and wine helps.
That's my hobby too. Provocative essay and wine. So
Yale is so proud of us.
I just think more broadly though, this is a question that we could do more with, and like maybe Amel and I can think about ways to like put some meat on this, and maybe if not, and I hate to ask too much of people's Zoom time. Zoom fatigue is real, man. Like, it really is. But there's
I think it would be important to try and think about this. Someone raised the pedagogical point earlier. I mean, to me, it's not. I don't put most of the energy about this question into teaching the grad students when I'm teaching democratization. I put more energy into it, and I think, Amel, you do too. I get the sense, at least in undergrad teaching, because I posed my first class yesterday. Today it was like, tell me what you think is if the U.S. quality of democracy is declining or not. And some of the I break them into groups, and it worked surprisingly well on Zoom. But a bunch of 2 or 3 of the groups said American democracy can't be is clearly they said democracy doesn't even exist in the U.S. Right? They were adamant that it can't be declining because there is no democracy. And it's like, they need perspective on the scope of they don't. I'm not saying, look, you love it or leave it, you should go to North Korea, but they do need to read about Saudi Arabia or North Korea or somewhere, and they do need to read about struggles for democracy in the U.S. and understand that things are different than they used to be, and that people were willing to die for those ideas, and many did, right? And they're just, they're seeing all the bad stuff in their view right now, and it's really live for them, really live wire for a lot of them. And so, that's why I try, for the grad students too, but I do try to take a step back and not just start with the criticism. And I get pushback on that, but I give them Freedom House, and I give them Dahl, and I say, oh, what's right and what's wrong with this kind of stuff, and they take it themselves, and they come up with some really good points.
Yeah, you'd rather be an opposition figure in the U.S. than be Alexei Navalny. Like, there's definite differences, or Jamal Khashoggi. Like, there are real differences.
Yeah. But when they get their hands dirty, like, I make my students actually go into Freedom House and look at the operational measures of democracy and apply it to a particular country, I mean, it really makes them scratch their head, not just about Turkey or whatever country they get assigned, you know, like, but about the US.
Yeah.
I think it's
So
a,
David, I do, you know, very similar exercises, but at the end of the day, all the nuance gets collapsed once you have to label something a democracy, you know, or a polyarchy even. It all just gets collapsed, and you need to go in on one team or another, or create, you know, these hybrid categories, or, you know, and there are lots of different ways to do it.
I don't like the categorization. That's why I tell them, like, Freedom House is a, you know, it's a 7-point scale. We could do a 100-point scale. It's like, we're talking about more or less and on different dimensions. And so I mean, I'll say, look, the US is a 1, whatever, on Freedom House, but what does that really mean? And we really do have a discussion about, should there be a 0 or a -1, you know, since 1 is the best, right, on that direction, on that stupid scale. Anyway, yeah.
Well, we have the title of our book, so thank you, Marianne. Teaching Democracy in Crisis Inside of a Democracy in Crisis.
It's good.
Yeah.
So I think we're at time. Everybody, thank you for participating. This was fun. It was so imperfect, but good job, everybody.
Just like democracy.
That's right.
That's right.